Welcome to It's All Mental, a podcast from Everyturn Mental Health. We're here to talk about every high and low, no limits, just good conversation.
Hello everyone, we're here today to talk about schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is a serious mental health condition that affects approximately 1 in 100 people. It affects how people think, how they behave, and it often makes it difficult for people just to live their daily lives. The symptoms of schizophrenia are broadly categorized into positive, which are those positive impacts, the new things that happen in their lives, like hallucinations, things like delusions. And then there's those negative symptoms. So things that flatten their mood, things that diminish people's abilities to live their normal lives, lack of motivation, blunted mood, reduced interest in social activities. It's commonly mistaken and thought that schizophrenia is just about hearing voices. People say things like, oh, I'm a bit schizophrenic, I hear voices. They make light of it by making comments, which really leads to the stigma that grows around schizophrenia, something that's really not particularly well understood as a mental health condition. In reality, this experience can be far more complex and varied than that. So today, we're going to talk about what schizophrenia is, what it really looks like, unravel some of those myths and understand the stigma, and discuss the importance of meaningful, person-centered help and support. And to do that, I am overjoyed to be joined by Louise Robinson, our service manager from Colway Lane, one of our adult services with Everyturn Mental Health. Louise, sorry I got your name wrong there straight away. Terrible start. Welcome.
Thank you very much. So it is a topic that's really close to my heart, I suppose, working in mental health for as long as I have, and particularly here at Colway Lane, working with adults, working age adults who suffer from schizophrenia. I think when I read the title of the podcast, is it just about hearing voices? It really isn't. And I think that is one of the most misconceptions that are out there, that is what this illness is. And it, for a lot of people who suffer from schizophrenia, some people don't even experience voice hearing. They might experience other types of hallucinations. So when we talk about voice hearing, that's an auditory hallucination. So that's something that is external from the person's mind, and it appears to come from an external source. So that might be a voice, that might be a sound. And broadly, people do experience lots of other types of hallucinations with schizophrenia. So that might affect their smell, their sight, all of our senses can be impacted by that. So really, it's just kind of touching the surface that we talk about voices associated with schizophrenia.
So a lot to unpack there, but before we do that, so from your experience, you worked in mental health for 14, 15 years as a mental health nurse?
Yes, that's right.
So you've worked, as a mental health nurse, working with adults with a whole range of severe mental illness and serious mental illness. And you've probably worked with countless number of people who've got schizophrenia, and you're currently doing your current role with Everyturn as well. So when we talk about saying things like, or people saying it's just hearing voices, how stigmatizing can that be for people who've got schizophrenia?
Yeah, I think it just really minimizes the impact of that illness on a person, to kind of narrow it down to that one experience. Like you mentioned there at the beginning, really we're looking at 3 components to the illness that really need to be present for somebody to receive that diagnosis. So so the negative symptoms, which often are the most debilitating for people, that flatness and social withdrawal, and the isolation that comes with that. And then again, the positive experiences, which are things that are added on to the person. So so we are talking about hallucinations, but we're also talking about delusions, believing things that aren't true, or experiencing paranoia. And then the cognitive elements of that, that affect people's decision making, and kind of that day-to-day function. So I think that to kind of single it down to hearing voices is, it's really minimizing the person's experience of that disorder.
And what, from your experience of working with people who have schizophrenia, and again, one of my other bugbears as well is when we talk about people being schizophrenic, and again,
Yes.
I get it's one of my I can't help but pull people up whenever
Yes.
people that you're schizophrenic. No, you have schizophrenia.
Mhm.
Let's stop using the term as an adjective to describe people and define people. It really so listeners out there, please be aware. Let's stop saying that when we talk about people, because
Absolutely.
you must see that all the time and hear that all the time. But from the people you work with who have schizophrenia, what is life like for them?
So it's really varied from person to person, and really how they experience those groups of symptoms really, and the level of treatment and care that's available to them. I think that's one of the real challenges faced for
Mhm.
people with this diagnosis is getting the right medication, the right support, so lots of those factors contribute how, someone can function day to day. I think it's important. I think one of the common myths with schizophrenia is that it can't be cured, or when somebody has it, kind of that's it. But that's very far from the truth,
Mm.
and recovery is absolutely possible with those right measures and, the right support in place. So you've got people who are, day to day functioning very highly, going to work, doing all the things that we do day to day. And then you do have other people who experience the illness in a more debilitating way, and do need that extra level of support, and, can find that day to day symptoms and experiences quite troubling and quite distressing. So it's very varied and a
Very,
very
very.
personal experience. Yeah.
And that comes back to what I said right at the start there, isn't it? About how that person-centered approach is really important, isn't it? Because that one-size-fits-all model doesn't work for what you've just said. And also that, as with everything in life, but also particularly with mental health, recovery is not a straight line, is it? So you could have just described this one person in that entire journey there, couldn't you? Someone who's been debilitated, someone who's
Absolutely.
high functioning, working, doing all those sorts of normal things that we talk about, but actually can quite quickly slip back. And and you must see that in your service quite regularly.
Yeah, absolutely. And, there's so many contributing factors to that journey. And, it can be down to what's going on in anybody's life at any one given time. And, the way that the individual experiences that illness has so many components to it.
Yeah.
So even things down to genetics and, biochemistry, there's, certain things in our biology that can make more symptoms more prevalent than other symptoms. um, Childhood trauma and things like that. So all of these things contribute to how the person would experience the illness. And then, yeah, life happens to us all. Life is difficult, and, life's in waves and goods and bads. And, with that, a person can relapse and, go through bad spells, and then, go into recovery again. And I think that's, really our role as mental health professionals is to avoid that as much as possible, to put those strategies in place to prevent relapse, promote recovery, and putting that bespoke package in place for people to keep them well.
Yeah. Yeah. And I talk about it often when I'm talking to people, and it's everything we talk about in mental health, but that biopsychosocial, the biological, the psychological, and the social, and how they interplay beautifully. You've just described, haven't you? Schizophrenia's got a biological aspect to it as much as it had got a massive psychological, but there's a huge social component to that factor as well, isn't there?
There really is.
So why do you think there's a fear? So people have a fear of people with schizophrenia. People, they'll hear that someone's got schizophrenia and they'll be wary. You don't hear someone's got depression and back off. You don't hear that someone's got anxiety and back off. But you hear that someone's got schizophrenia and naturally people back off. What do you think causes that?
I think it's most certainly and largely the way that people are portrayed in the media. I think that, when terrible things happen, crimes and, especially violent and shocking crimes, if the person happens to have a diagnosis of schizophrenia, the media will
Mm.
grab onto that as a shock factor, as a kind of a shocking headline. And with that, they fail to mention, was the right treatment in place for this person? What support were in place? Did they have access to services? And, they go into that shock factor. And I think, even some, films and things like, like Psycho, and
Mm.
that portrays people with schizophrenia type illnesses. And I think that sits with people, and they do develop this fear that, someone with schizophrenia is violent, when actually, they're more likely to be the victim of violence than they
Yeah,
are to actually commit violence.
yeah.
So yeah, I think the media have a lot to answer for when it comes to accurately portraying what this illness is like, and the real people out there living with it.
And it's a scary illness. If your perception is completely altered, whether that's auditory or visual or whichever it is, but if your perception is constantly altered, and if you are paranoid, if you are having those delusions, it is a terrifying state to be in, isn't it?
It really is. And I think what a lot of people don't know is that these experiences for people are very, very real.
Mm.
And to somebody experiencing that, it's as real as me and you looking at each other, seeing each other right now. Which is, if you can put yourself in that position for a moment, very, very scary.
I watched a video recently, and I was trying to find the link to share with this, but somebody has created some videos. So they've interviewed lots of people with schizophrenia who've got differing, whether it's auditory or visual or whichever hallucinations, and they've made visuals of what life potentially looks like for people, and it's fascinating, and it's terrifying. And you can see
Yeah.
how agitation could happen. You can see why withdrawal happens because of all those sorts of things. And like you say, the media's got a huge part to play in the sensationalization. If you talk about
I always
schizophrenia, people think,
remember,
sorry.
yeah, being a student nurse so many moons ago, and um, being on my first inpatient placement, and I was doing night shift, and I'd kind of turned onto a corridor, and I seen this lady, and she was running towards me for her life. She was terrified. And as she approached us, she kind of wrapped her arms around us. She was crying. She was so distressed. And she was actually experiencing a visual hallucination of seeing a tiger in
Mm,
her bedroom. And that fear and that
mm.
hurt was so, so real. Um, and I think that was probably my first real experience of seeing how, terrifying it really, really can be.
Yeah. We talk there's a big medical component to schizophrenia. So there's a big part of medication. So we talk about the social impacts, and particularly in every term we talk an awful lot about the social determinants and all the things we do to not medicalize mental health. But schizophrenia is something that is quite medicalized and highly medicalized because of the drug treatments that are often necessary to get people into a recovery state. But what other factors do you see as being beneficial to people who have schizophrenia to give them the support they require in a person-centered way?
Yeah, I think we're going back to the biopsychosocial model, and there is most certainly a place for medication to support people who experience schizophrenia, but it really is only one element of the picture. It's one piece of the jigsaw puzzle, and the other parts come from, you know, ensuring that social support is there. People are supported. I think a lot of the barriers that people face with this diagnosis associated with the stigma is, getting into employment, getting into housing, that because there is this stigma that people are violent, that people are, that this is something that, they have this, and that means that they can't function, there's no recovery. Because of those stigmas, is that the right word? Stigmas.
Yeah.
People really do struggle, that, the impact of that on people's lives is
Yeah.
very real. And that's where our role sits. Well, yes, medication is important, and there's, heavy monitoring that goes with that
Mhm.
as well. That can be in itself a hinder. The side effects from some of those
Yeah.
medications can be debilitating in themselves. You know, Supporting people to access the right housing, support to get people into employment, and fighting that stigma is so important for people, for them to be able to live full lives.
I spent many years in a former life running clozapine services for people. For those listening, clozapine is a sort of second line antipsychotic used for treatment resistant schizophrenia. So people where everything else isn't working, clozapine, but it's got hideous side effects that can lead to some pretty nasty things with your bloods, and it can lead to serious infections and so on and so forth. So it's only used very sparingly when absolutely necessary. But the difference it makes to people's lives, but the fear that people even have around using the drugs because of that is, and then the monitoring and how you look after people, it can be so debilitating. And it's like you say, we have to do that whole picture piece around what else do we do to support. So leading on to then the last question I want to ask you is, what would you like to see as a change in how society works with, treats, has people with schizophrenia just operating normally within? What does society, what would you like to see as the change?
I think I would like to see elimination of that stigma associated with schizophrenia, because I think it does cause so many barriers for people. And I think that starts with educating, and like you were saying before, calling out terms like schizophrenic, that is not a term that we use. The use of that language means that is who they are, and it really isn't. It's part of the person they are. It's something that they experience. It's not who they are. And using that in our platforms and our roles to promote that and educate people, I think that's where it starts. And also, in the media, it would be helpful to have more coverage around recovery for people, and actually people who are living very full, happy lives with this disorder, and normalizing that. I think that's where I would like to see it. I know that the diagnosis itself isn't as common as it used to be, and that is largely associated with the stigma. So some more I suppose mindful psychiatrists might give a diagnosis of a psychotic disorder, or something that it is ultimately the same thing, but not as stigmatizing as that diagnosis.
So this is all about removing the stigma, removing the negative
Absolutely.
connotations, educating people that it can happen to you, it can happen to I, it could happen to a family member, and actually that's fine. And these are not violent criminals. These are not people who are, out to do bad all the time. These are just normal
And I think
people.
it's more common as well than people think. So you talk about, it's 1 in 100 people who experience schizophrenia in their lives, and that's likely to type 1 diabetes. 1 in 100 people have type 1 diabetes, and kind of the spectrum of stigmatization with those two things couldn't be further apart.
Absolutely. No, it's a great point to end on. Let's normalize this. Let's normalize our language, and let's remove the stigma. Louise, this has been a wonderfully insightful conversation, and thank you for the work you and the team do working with the types of people we've just been describing day in, day out, and giving them meaningful purpose and journeys to recovery, which is just always magnificent to see. And we were just talking before we came on camera about the joy and the life that brings to you, and the wind in your sails that you get from seeing that recovery journey with people.
Absolutely. Yes,
Louise,
I
thank you
really
so
do.
much.
I really do love it. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to It's All Mental, a podcast from Everyturn Mental Health. If you enjoyed this episode, remember to follow, rate and share. See you next time.